It was the spring concert for 8th grade chorus. And those of us who had been raised on the Disney animated renaissance of the 1990s, we who were in the select chorus, that was the auditioned chorus, we were excited that we were going to be performing, ending the concert, with a 10-minute medley of the songs from Beauty and the Beast. We opened with Belle and transitioned into Be Our Guest. We even had a staged fight during the singing of Gaston. But the pinnacle of the performance came with a duet of the title song, a la Celine Dion and Peebo Bryson. And I was Peebo. And Kendra Crabtree was Celine. All was going well on the stage in the gym of Cedar Bluff Middle School. And as Mrs. Bridge transitioned on that old upright on the stage into the final song, Kendra and I made our way to the 2 microphones at the front of the stage under the basketball goal. We sang, we harmonized, we traded the melody back and forth. And then at the very end, the last line of the whole concert, the last concert of all of middle school, Kendra had the melody, Beauty and the Beast. And I had the harmony part above it, Beauty and the Beast. But you got to remember, I'm in the 8th grade, and I'm a male human. And you know what happens to male humans in their early teenage years. So what actually came out of my mouth in that moment was, Beauty and the Beast. And there was laughter, and my face turned red. I was embarrassed. I can tell that story now in such vivid detail because it's become my go-to story. Whenever you're at one of these icebreaker, get-to-know-you things, people say, tell us a story that's embarrassing from your life. That's a good one to tell that's not too provocative. But I've also remembered it because to my 8th grade self at that time, it wasn't just something I was able to laugh off in the moment. If I could go back now to myself then, I would say, hey, this is no big deal. You screwed up. You had no control over it. It actually was pretty funny. But to me at that time, what I felt was not that I had screwed up, but a voice that sometimes still rises up in me in other scenarios. The voice said, you are a screw up, and now everybody knows it. You know what we call the difference between screwing up and being a screw up? It's shame. When you screw up, there can be the emotion of guilt that comes with that. You know what you've done is wrong and you need to make it right. That can be a helpful emotion because it can drive us to try to repair the harm we've done. But when the results of our mistakes or our sin leads us to say, I have no value, I am just a terrible, insufficient, destructive person at my core, that's shame. If there's something you've done wrong, and you've been forgiven by the person you hurt or offended, and you've done whatever you needed to do to make things right, and yet the memory of it still persists and lingers, and you cannot let it go, you can't forgive yourself, that's a wrestling with shame. More mild example, you have a Christmas party. Y'all remember what Christmas parties were? You have a Christmas party, and somebody comes up and they say, hey, I like the punch you made, but you know what will make it even better? If you put fresh slices of oranges in the punch. And some folks say, oh, that's a great idea. Thank you. That's really helpful. I might try that. But another person who deals with shame might say, this person thinks I'm a terrible host. They don't even want to be here. What if everybody here is only here out of pity and doesn't really think I'm good at this? It can be the parent who's worried that people are going to find out that their kid got sent home from college on academic probation, or they had to admit them into the rehab facility. Or even that they're concerned that their kids quit scouts or the team or the band or the AP path to college. If people find out, I'm going to be labeled the bad parent. That's shame. Paul the Apostle obviously knew about shame. He opens his letter to the Christians in Rome by saying, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." This letter, Paul writes, it's an introduction letter. Paul doesn't know these people, though he knows about them. We can tell that from the verses we read. And they've obviously heard of Paul and his mission, but he's never visited their churches on his time. And so when Paul is introducing himself to these people, what he wants to introduce to them about himself and his mission is that the gospel brings us freedom from shame. And so using this letter to the Romans, we're starting today with this 6-week series that we're calling Some Assembly Required. You know that phrase. You get the Christmas gift for your kid, right? The kitchen that's life-size that they can play with and pretend to cook, or the play set for the backyard that comes in a big box. And it's going to be magnificent, but it's all there in a box, usually with a lot of styrofoam and an instruction manual that says at the top, "Some assembly required." So you've got all the pieces that you need to put together this great thing that you want for your kids, but you've got to figure out how it all goes together. We're also in January, 10 days in, New Year's, time for resolutions and new commitments. Maybe New Year's resolutions are like the grown-up version of Some Assembly Required. We know what pieces we want to put together to make up a life that's meaningful, that we think will help us to be whole, but we've got to figure out how they all fit together so that we can have the life that we think we ought to and deserve to have. We're going to be thinking today as we start this series on the pieces we put together, and are we actually even capable of figuring it out to get the life we want? I was in New York City a couple of years ago with a group of pastors. We met with a fascinating guy named Casper ter Kuile. An interesting fellow. He's Danish, graduate of Harvard Divinity School, and a person who, while he appreciates the practices of faith communities and the way that they bond people together, he's not somebody who actually subscribes to a particular faith tradition. And in fact, his career is spent studying alternative communities to churches, synagogues, mosques, where people find their spiritual lives that generations ago would have been the automatic place of the church or a religious community where people would attend. We met with him in a classroom at the Marble Collegiate Church in Manhattan, and he told us about several groups. The first one he talked about was the CrossFit community, and he talked about how the team-building workouts of CrossFit are like ritualized activities. The community has celebrations of achievement that people have as they make progress through the program, and they offer accountability and support to one another, a kind of emotional and spiritual support, not just in achieving their next exercise goal, but even in the stuff that they bring from their lives into the gym. They work through that together. He talked about another group called the Dinner Party. Dinner Party is a group of 20 and 30-somethings, people who've had a parent or a sibling die. There are pockets, communities in lots of different cities across the nation where young people gather to talk through their grief and to share a meal around the table and to say, this is what it's like as a young adult trying to make it without a mother living or a father living. He even talked about Soul Cycle, the exercise program that has these effervescent, transcendent highs as a part of it, and communal support built into its structure as well. He said that each of these groups he studied and others that were in this same category shared certain values. He said that they are each seeking societal transformation and individual transformation, and that happens through creativity, accountability, the discovery of a life's purpose, and the formation of a community. And I couldn't figure out at the moment, but something about this just didn't sit well with me, and I didn't know if it was just my own self-preservation as a minister, because I'm a better pastor than I would be a CrossFit coach, I can tell you that, or what it was that I felt like there was still a disconnect between these kinds of communities and a Christian faith community. And I think I've come up with it, and it's not that I reject CrossFit or going to the dinner party or doing an art class or having yoga classes at work. That's all fine. Actually, what they get right is that they acknowledge that there is a way of life that we desire to live. We want to live rightly. They're calling to that ancient primal part of each of our souls. There's some kind of wholeness that we want that's beyond our present circumstance. But what makes those communities different from Christianity is that they say that by achieving or attaining or participating in this program, we will actually get to that place where we live rightly. If we just stick with the program, and we're going to have this community that's going to surround us and support us as we move from who we are now to who we can become by our good effort and the work of our friends around us. And that's really enticing to think, like, here's the actual step-by-step plan to the life that I think I want. But it's January 10th. How many folks made a New Year's resolution? How many folks have already broken their New Year's resolution? How many folks have ever kept a New Year's resolution? I've kept one. I learned to drink black coffee. That was like 5 years ago. How do you feel about yourself when you set these goals? I'm going to do it this time. Knuckle down. And you fail. Shame, maybe? When Paul says in this letter that he's not ashamed of the gospel, obviously he's responding to somebody or something that tells him that he ought to be ashamed of the gospel. And think about it. It makes sense that you would be. First, this message of Jesus, it comes from a community of nobodies, working class merchants, uneducated fishermen. They don't have the right degrees, the right prominence, the right power. And here you have Paul, who was a Pharisee. He came from a noble Jewish family. He was well-groomed, well-educated. Paul knew you go to the expert for the book. You go to the wise sage to seek wisdom for living. And yet here he is saying that the gospel has come to us from these smelly fishermen and these poor merchants, from the workers and the impoverished and the marginalized. Then the message that these people bring is that the death of Jesus, executed on a Roman cross, the cruelest of punishments the empire had for its worst criminals, that's the guy we're going to follow. Not to mention that when you were crucified, you were hung before all people naked, which we can't even comprehend in our society, the shame that brought on a person to have their body exposed in that way. You don't come back from that. You don't lift up that person as somebody that you're going to follow. And then the third shameful piece of the gospel is that this Jesus, who was crucified by the empire, who was told to be raised from the dead, he didn't have any real power. He wasn't mighty in the way that we understand that. I mean, think about these Christians in Rome. They're in the capital of the most powerful empire in human history. This is the home of Caesar Augustus, of the Colosseum, of the Roman Forum. Tom Holland, the British historian, says, command and swagger were the very essence of the cult of the Caesars. To rule as an emperor was to rule as a victorious general. In every town, statues of Caesar served as a reminder to his subjects that to rank as the Son of God was by definition to embody earthly greatness. And yet Paul says of Jesus in our reading for today that Jesus is the Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness, not by earthly greatness, but by resurrection from the dead. True power not in force or bullying, not in military might or political zealotry, but in weakness, in submission, in self-giving love to one's rivals and even to one's enemies. So you, Paul, educated, bright, Pharisaic Jew, and a Roman citizen to boot, is going to say that the Son of God is this wandering rabbi from Nazareth who was crucified by the state and who never won a single battle or victory or conquered anyone. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. And yet, Paul is shameless for this message of Jesus Christ, because he says it has the power to save. It has the power to save us from our shame. It saves us from the educational meritocracy that says, if I just complete the next degree, if I just read the next book, then I will know enough and be enough. It also saves us from the bitterness that comes when we don't reach that goal. It frees us from the convention that says, I've got to surround myself with people who are like me or who I want to become one day, and try to remove myself from those who are of a lower station than me. It frees us from that social stratification. It makes the boundaries of human relationships more porous and crosses more lines. And it frees us from the need to assert ourselves through intimidation and through violence. True power, according to the gospel, comes when we've decided we actually don't need the title anymore. And Paul says that freedom from all of those temptations, that is righteousness. Now, I know some folks might be tuning in today, you haven't been in church in a long time, and you say, okay, here goes the preacher. He's talking about how Christians are righteous and they do everything right. No! That's self-righteousness. Everybody hates that. Okay? The righteousness of God, the gospel of God that is righteousness, is that the good news of God is not at all dependent on your achievement, your performance, your attainment. It's not about you always living rightly. The gospel is a gift. What makes God righteous, according to this letter, is God's power to make us right. And what Paul wants the Romans to know, what Paul wants us to know, what I want y'all to know today, is that you are freed from your shame because you've been given God's righteousness in Jesus already. That's a complete change of mind and heart and attitude, to live out of the gift of already being right instead of working to get better and to finally achieve it. That's the gospel. About 3 years ago, I was at what's called a presbytery meeting. If you're not familiar with Presbyterian churches, a presbytery meeting is a gathering of church leaders from different Presbyterian churches in our geographic area. And when we all get together, at the beginning of the meeting, there's a time that you introduce people who've never been to a presbytery meeting before. And so we were going around the room as they usually do, and the pastor of Blacksburg Presbyterian was standing up, and there was a young woman standing next to her, and she said, I want to introduce to the presbytery today our new communications director. She comes to us from Knoxville, Tennessee. My eyes lit up. I want the presbytery to meet today Miss Kendra Crabtree. My 8th grade Beauty and the Beast duet partner. From the go-to story of embarrassment that I tell was standing before the presbytery being introduced in the sanctuary of the First Presbyterian Church of Lynchburg, Virginia. And so at the break, I ran up to Kendra. We connected, we caught up, we chatted. I didn't bring up my voice cracking in the concert or any of the other shameful middle school memories. Some of those had faded simply because of time and growing up, yes. But there was something about that moment with this person from a story I'd told countless times now being introduced in the church community where I live. It felt like I was free. That there was some power saying it's right. As though Paul was scrawling out in his pen over again, it's not that you got it right. It's that a righteous God's got